talk with you a little bit more about Paul and Tarsus, the city where he was born, and we're going to find that in just a little while he's going back there. So I want to talk about it with you. It's kind of interesting to me. He was in the province of Cilicia, which is in the Roman area of Asia Minor. It was actually a part of Turkey. It was right, well, I decided I wasn't going to do a map tonight. I should have, but right in that curve that switches from Syria around to Turkey today. It was from a city there. We talked about a little bit. One of the governors of this area was a fellow by the name of Cicero, and this was a little bit before the time of Paul, and perhaps right about the time of his birth. But he comments about it. He writes. He was a big writer in the Roman period. A lot of his letters are still existent, but some of his correspondence will give you some idea of what the Roman officials were like in this area. He's surrounded constantly by the Greeks in that area who are very obsequious. He would travel with an interpreter fairly regularly because the official language that the Romans had was Latin. So he would travel with an interpreter to try to convey that to the underlings throughout this area. He put down the bandits. We talked a little bit about that last week. He's saluted by the title Imperator or Emperor in this area. He actually was governor over not only Cilicia, but if you look at a Bible map of this period of time, he was governor of Pamphylia, Pisidia, Lycaonia. He was also governor of the island of Cyprus, and so extremely detailed. He brags on himself a lot. As you read about him, you find that he allowed free access to his person, which was very unusual for the Romans. He refused allowing them to build expensive monuments in his name. He brags on himself a lot. And Cicero was like this. He was sort of a conservative. He declined the presence of certain kings who were paupers and broke. He abstained from exacting the expenses when he traveled. There was a tax wherever he went, and he avoided that tax. So the people loved him, or at least he said they loved him. He treated the Greek magistrates with some consideration and so forth. And you can see from his letters that if this was abnormal, how much corruption and cruelty and abuse and pride the Roman governors would usually have exacted when you read over in the New Testament of Pilate and Felix and some of the others. He doesn't say a lot about the Jews, but in some of his later letters that he writes from Rome, he regarded the Jews with serious contempt. And so Paul and his family would not have received a wonderful reception at his hand. You also ought to know what was happening in Judea just before the time of Paul. Judea in about 100 AD was under the hand of the Seleucid Greeks. And one of them, who was a very enlightened man, he gets a bad rap in Josephus, but he was a very enlightened man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And he had a wonderful plan, and everywhere else he went, it was just a terrific plan, and that was to sort of Greekize all of the provinces and the people, and he would build monuments and statues to the gods and beautify the area, and everybody just loved him, except in Palestine. Throughout Syria and Cilicia, He would have been wonderful, but he happened to be one of the places he happened to rule was in Palestine. And they hated him there. He finally wound up offering pigs on the altar. You can imagine how they were excited about that. And his rule as a Seleucid ignited a Hasmonean rebellion led by a family of Maccabees. And so roughly 100 years before the birth of Christ, they rebelled. They led the rebellion. One of the fellows was John Hyrcanus, who reigned over, they rebelled successfully, basically, and ruled for a period of time under a very prosperous and independent kingdom. But in the time of the second Hyrcanus, one of his brothers, the Maccabees had sort of fallen down. And Judea was basically waiting for the arrival of the Romans. And it came in the person of Pompey the Great, who came with his armies. He came into Syria, and basically the Hasmonean rebellion just sort of caved in right about there. This was about 63 BC. And so for a while there, he came in the spring of 63. There was a pause in the misery of the Jews when the Romans took over. It was a good thing. And shortly after this, if you're familiar with your Roman history, Julius Caesar comes to the fore in this area, and he's followed by Augustus. And there's some wars going on at this time, but they're going on a long way from Palestine. So Palestine is enjoying a tremendous period of prosperity during this time. But then after Augustus, there's Tiberius and Claudius, who drove an enormous number of Jews into banishment. Caligula, who followed them as emperor, seriously persecuted the Jews. And so a lot of the Jews in Tarsus would have been severely persecuted. Tarsus was, the Jews, or the Romans had several descriptions of their cities. Some of them were described as a municipality, basically. The others were described as a colony. And Philippi, for instance, in Macedonia, or Antioch in Pisidia were colonies. And what this means is they would bring the fire from the Forum in Rome, that eternal flame they kept burning, and it would be ignited there in that city, and that city had the same rights and privileges as Rome. So we're going to see Paul and others going to Philippi in a little while, and that you're going to have to realize that was a different thing. But Tarsus was a free city. I think the word was Urbs Labira. It was a free city in that it could have its own government, its own police force, military, and Seleucia and Antioch, just over in Syria, were in the same situation. And so they were very much left alone as a result of that situation. You know that Paul at this time is called Saul. And it's real difficult to understand why he has those two names. Kind of hard to fathom why he had the two names. One suggests that he always had two names. His father, of course, was a Roman citizen. We know that. We don't know exactly how he got it, how he achieved that Roman citizenship, more than likely as a result of service in some of those civil wars that I mentioned just a little bit earlier. But, and so one suggestion is he always had two names. Saul is a Hebrew name. Paul is a Roman name. They mean something entirely different. But others suggest, and if you'll notice it as we go on, that over in the 13th chapter of Acts, we're going to notice that that's roughly the point at which Paul changes his name. He's never known as Saul again after this 13th chapter of Acts. And say about verse 4, there's where we would pick it up. He goes to Cyprus, and there he is influential in the conversion of the governor of that city, Sergius Paulus, a prudent man. And it was a very considerable custom among the Romans to adopt another man's name. So Paul may have been an influential Roman at his birth, but it is significant that Sergius Paulus, who's converted, here's the governor, and from then on, Saul takes on the name Paul. The Bible doesn't say why, but it is sort of an obvious thing that you see. For instance, Josephus, as he was writing later on, called himself Flavius, as a relationship with Titus, and who were Flavians. That was their family name. I wanted to talk about a couple other things during this period, just sort of set the stage. There were two very learned rabbis at this time, two schools of rabbis in Judea. They were Hillel was one of them. I think I've mentioned his name to you before. And the other one was Shammai. Hillel believed in more traditional government. He was, Jesus kept rebuking. They were both Pharisees. But Hillel was really, he believed that the traditions of the Jews were just about as authoritative as the law itself. Shammai, who was another one of these rabbis, he sort of put the law itself up on a little higher pedestal than their traditions, and they argued quite a bit. Of these two schools, Hillel was probably the most popular and influential. He was the father of Simeon, and it's interesting. It may be a possibility. Some people suggest it, that you remember when Mary brings Jesus into the temple, there when he's 40 days old, to make sacrifice for him and for herself for their cleansing. Remember, there's two people that she meets in the temple. One was Anna, who blesses Jesus. The other was a man by the name of Simeon. And he would have been at this time a very old man, but he was the father of Gamaliel. Now, I can't guarantee that the Simeon that Mary met in the temple was this Simeon, but it would be interesting, it'd be reasonable, it's possible that it could be true. Gamaliel was the height, really, of the Jewish rabbis. We've already seen him in that controversy with Peter and the other apostles, where he counsels them to not do anything, that if it's not of God, it'll amount to nothing. You remember that? There's a lot of people who've tried to argue that he was, for instance, he was called the beauty of the law. And in the Talmud, it says, since Rabbi Gamaliel died, the glory of the law has ceased. He wasn't too bigoted, as we've seen over there earlier in that chapter, what is the fourth chapter, I think. But I've seen some who write about him and suggest that, well, maybe he became a Christian. Don't count too much on that. He died about 18 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, so roughly about, what would that be, 52, 53 AD? About the same time that Paul had that shipwreck at Malta, roughly the same period of time in the Bible. And one of his pupils, who was an author of the Targum, raised to him a funeral pile of rich materials that had never been known except at the burial of a king. He was highly, highly respected. And of course, he was Paul's teacher. But he wasn't a Christian. This is one of his sayings, and it was a curse. He says, let there be no hope to them who apostatize from the true religion. And let heretics, how many soever they be, all perish as in a moment. And let the kingdom of pride be speedily rooted out and broken in our days. Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, who destroyest the wicked and bringest down the proud. So I don't think he became a Christian at all. Okay, let's go to this. I've talked about it. I'm not going to go over too much more with you. Let's finish this chapter. We're going to start in verse 23. When we last left Paul, he was in Damascus. He had been there for 3 years. He had been preaching. If you look in Galatians, the first and second chapters, you'll see the fact that it tells you he went into Arabia, preached a while in Arabia. The king of Arabia and the king of Damascus at this time, I think we've talked about him, was a fellow named Aretas. He didn't actually rule in Damascus. There was an ethnarch who ruled for him in Damascus, and under him who was a governor. Either because of the affinity, there were roughly 40,000 Jews in Damascus. And most of these Jews hated Herod, the tetrarch. And so Aretas may have, because of his affinity for the Jews, it may have been something Paul did or said during those 3 years he was preaching. He gets up a pretty good grudge against him. And Paul, when he talks about it later, I believe it's in the, I can't remember, I think it's the 22nd chapter, he says that the ethnarch had initiated this plot. After many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel to kill him. But their lying await was known of Saul, and they watched the gates day and night to kill him. Then the disciples took him by night and let him down by the wall in a basket. A lot of these houses were built on the wall. They overhung the wall. And so it'd be pretty easy to come out a window and rope pulley down. The basket in this case that was described was, we'll call it wicker. It was at least a woven basket. Later on, we're going to see him escaping in a different kind of conveyance, but this time it was in a woven basket. And he escapes, and he comes to Jerusalem. When he gets there, he tries to join himself to the disciples, but they were all afraid of him and believed not that he was a disciple. Hang on. I've got to get some things in and out of the way here. So it's roughly 3 years after he was converted that he makes his escape. And he comes to Damascus, or comes to Jerusalem. When Saul was come to Jerusalem, he essayed to join himself to the disciples, but they were all afraid of him and believed not that he was a disciple. It's important that we establish membership with other Christians. Paul could have come down here and just started preaching on his own, but it was important that he join himself to the other Christians here. And they are understandably afraid of him. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. How did Barnabas know about it? How was he aware that Paul was okay, safe? Don't know. Very real possibility. Barnabas, we know, was from Cyprus, which, if you look at the map again, is actually just a few miles off the coast of Cilicia. Very real possibility. He had gone to school maybe over there in Cilicia. Some suggest, loved the idea that Barnabas and Paul and Luke all attended the same, basically, university at some point over there in Cilicia. So anyway, somehow or another, Barnabas must have known him or known of him. And maybe because they're both from the same area, they had some affinity for one another. He brings him to the apostles and declared unto them how he had seen the Lord in the way, and that he had spoken to him, how he'd preached boldly at Damascus in the name of Jesus. And so then they went on ahead. They heard about this, and Barnabas speaks for him, well known there, and he was with them coming in and going out of Jerusalem. And he spake boldly in the name of the Lord Jesus and disputed against the Grecians, but they went about to slay him. Now, Grecians is not Greeks. These were Greek-speaking Jews, usually called Hellenists. You remember who Stephen was fighting with? Stephen was fighting with these same synagogues. And suddenly, Paul has come back here basically and taken Stephen's place. He killed Stephen back over there in the 6th and 7th chapters, and now, in essence, has taken his place and is disputing with the same group of people that he had once been encouraging to kill Christians. They went about to slay him, which when the brethren knew, they brought him down to Caesarea, which was the best port in that area, roughly a little bit north of modern-day Haifa. But it was I could show you a picture, I will one of these days, of a reconstruction of it. Caesarea's port was man-made. It wasn't a natural port. It wasn't a natural bay. There are really not many natural bays along the Palestinian coast. And so they had completely constructed, the Romans had. It was, in essence, their capital. It was where the Roman governor stayed most of the time, and most of their troops were. So they knew he would be safe there, and from there he could take ship and sail the couple hundred miles north to Tarsus. So I want to talk about that a little bit, because this trip explains a lot of things. He goes back to Tarsus and is there for a while, but we don't hear any more about him until we get over to the 11th chapter. But I want to show you a couple of things that this will go a long way toward explaining. Look in Acts 15. Well, I ought to dip my fingers in this glass. Now, Acts 15 here, I want you to notice with me verse 28, where we read, well, let's see. Is this what I want? 23. Eyes are a terrible thing to waste. This is after this conference in the 15th chapter of Acts. They wrote letters by them. Paul has been brought back and so forth. He's been preaching in Antioch for a while. But now they wrote letters by them after this manner: the apostles and elders and brethren send greetings unto the brethren which were of the Gentiles in Antioch, in Syria, and Cilicia. Now, Antioch, we know Paul and Barnabas were preaching in Antioch. But what about this Cilicia thing? There's no indication that anybody had been in Cilicia before this except Paul. He went back to Tarsus, and so he undoubtedly spent his time preaching there and founded congregations in that area. All right. I might mention that a lot of his relatives, or some of his relatives, had Greek names, whereas two of them that are mentioned over the book of Revelation had Latin names, which was on your Roman names. Then had the churches rest throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria, and were edified. So here we have reference to Judea, Galilee, where there's churches, and Samaria. So we know there were people who were converted there, but now we're told that there were churches there. And they were built up, walking in the fear of the Lord, and in the comfort of the Holy Ghost were multiplied. So it was a considerable situation. I want you to notice another passage. Paul did not go peacefully. Look with me in Acts 22. Here I want you to notice verses. We'll start with verse 17. He says, it came to pass that when I was come again to Jerusalem, Paul's referring to this time. He says he was baptized, and when I was come again to Jerusalem, even while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance. He was only there in Jerusalem about 15 days. We learn that from Galatians 1st and 2nd chapter. He spent time in the house of Peter, talking with Peter. He says he's very careful to tell us that before that, for 3 years, he had not had to consult with any of the apostles. So they did not convey to him the gospel. He had done this by inspiration on his own through Ananias teaching him what he could. But for 3 years, he wasn't dependent on the apostles, for the other apostles, for the truth. So he comes here to Jerusalem, and he, as I say, he's only here 15 days. There's a plot. He's talking about it. He says, while I prayed in the temple, I was in a trance, and saw him saying, Jesus saying unto me, make haste. And I commented about this in a lesson a week ago, that the word that he uses here for trance or vision is different than the word that he uses for what he experienced on the road to Damascus. He says, they will not receive thy testimony concerning thee. And I said, Lord, they know that I imprisoned and beat in every synagogue them that believed on thee. And when the blood of thy martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by and consenting unto his death, and kept the raiment of them that slew him. And he said unto me, depart, for I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. What I wanted you to see basically was he was arguing with the Lord. He wanted to stay there. He wanted to stay there, and he wanted to fight to convince these people. And he disagreed with the idea that I've got to escape. He said, hey, they know this. I can convince them. I can tell them. And Paul says, no. Or the Lord says to him, no, you get out of town. You're not going to succeed at this. Get out of Dodge. It is remarkable that throughout his life, Paul wants to come back here to Jerusalem, and he wants very badly to teach these people, and it doesn't really work. Anywho, a couple of things. Let's see. I said I was going to get through this. So we return. We leave Paul, and we go back to. This is a fairly short voyage across here. There's a number of things that happened to Paul during this time that the Scripture just doesn't tell us about. They do tell us about, but about the only time they could have happened was during this period of time when he's in Cilicia. For instance, that list, he gives us a list over there in 2 Corinthians of all the things that he had done that had happened to him. For instance, he says, 5 times he received of the Jews 40 stripes save one. 3 shipwrecks, night and a day that he spent in the deep. When did that happen? We don't know when it happened. But the only time it could have happened to Paul was this period of time when he goes north, roughly when he goes north to Tarsus. He's writing about that in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, about verse 16. And so it was undoubtedly a very busy period of time. I might also mention that verse 41 of Acts 15 also adds information about those churches and says, at that time, in Acts 15:41, as he left this conference in Jerusalem, they went through Syria. That would have involved Antioch and Seleucia and Cilicia, confirming the churches. So probably at Tarsus and other places throughout this area that we leave him. You need to realize that we're going to see in a couple of chapters, chapter 13, Paul going on that period of life that we always refer to, his first missionary journey. But you forget the fact that between the time he's converted here in this 9th chapter and that 13th chapter, there's 10 years. He's been a Christian by the time he goes on that trip for 10 years before that first journey there in Acts 13 and Acts 14. So a lot happened to him during that period of time that the text simply is not telling us much about. What we have here are 2 miracles that are performed by Peter. We know that we've left him last at Samaria. We know that he came back to Jerusalem. He spends some time with Paul in Jerusalem. But then it came to pass as Peter passed throughout all quarters, he didn't just stay in Jerusalem. He was going to some of these other areas. He came down to the saints which dwelt at Lydda. And I've shown you this on a map. I'll remind you, sooner or later I'll drag out those maps again. But Lydda was over on the coast. And he's there teaching and preaching. And he found a certain man named Aeneas, which had kept his bed 8 years and was sick of the palsy. And Peter said unto him, Aeneas, Jesus Christ maketh thee whole. Arise and make thy bed. And he arose immediately, and all that dwelt at Lydda and Sharon, that would be the plain of Sharon. Sharon is about a 12-mile wide plain in Palestine that stretches from the sea up to those mountains. Actually, they're sort of low foothills, about maybe 3,000 feet up. But this is the plain of Sharon. We sing about it in a song, Jesus Rose of Sharon. We're singing about that plain down there. So he says, all that dwelt at Lydda and Sharon saw him. From there, he moves on to Joppa, which is just a little bit north of there, also on the coast. And this is pretty well modern-day Haifa, if you look at a modern-day map of Israel. There was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. Remember, this is Luke writing to Theophilus. So he gives us her Hebrew name first, and he's giving us the interpretation of it as Dorcas. And her name meant gazelle. Or it meant gazelle, or the creature with the beautiful look. So if you look in the Song of Solomon, you'll find that the gazelle was always a picture of a beautiful animal. So if you were going to describe your girlfriend, you'd say that she has the eyes of a gazelle. So you might not use other bodily parts, but the eyes of a gazelle is it's kind of romantic, don't you think, Travis? Yes. I don't know. We'll one of these days we'll get your girlfriend to drag out all the poetry you're writing. Don't do that. They blackmail you with it later. It's awful. There's no mention of a husband, so she's probably either unmarried or a widow. And she is only the second woman mentioned in the book of Acts. You might notice that. Who was the first one? This is a test. Who? Phoebe. Nope, wrong book. That's in Romans. Second woman mentioned in Acts. Who was the first one? Nope, that's later. That's in the 16th chapter. Mary? No. Sapphira was the one before this. So, it came to pass in those days she was sick and died, whom when they had washed, they laid her in an upper chamber. So she was really dead. You know, a lot of people try to claim, well, these people are still alive. They were just sort of passed out. You don't understand the procedures they went through to prepare these bodies to bury them. They'd washed her body. They'd put, just as they did for Jesus, there were spices all around her. They'd wrapped her up so that she wouldn't smell. And then, according to their law, she'd have to be buried roughly within a day, 24 hours. So, for as much as Lydda was nigh to Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent unto them 2 men, desiring him that he would not delay to come to them. Then Peter arose and went with them. When he was come, they brought him into an upper chamber. And all the widows stood by him weeping. We talked about, we were studying the Gospel of Luke, and we were talking about the death of the daughter of the... Who? Jairus' daughter. Yeah, thank you. And how their lute player, they would have been at least... If you were poor, there would have only been one lute player. If you were not poor, there would have been 2 or 3. And there would have been wailing people. There were undoubtedly women around whose job it was to go wail. And besides that, she had a lot of friends. She had done nice things for her. So they were all wailing and screaming and hollering. So that was the sort of thing it was. And they were showing him coats and garments which Dorcas made while she was with them. So she was a generous and a kind woman. Peter put them all forth. Remember, Jesus did the same thing. It was kind of hard to maneuver around all the hooting and hollering and lute playing and screaming and so forth, and kneeled down and prayed, and turning to the body said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes. When she saw Peter, she sat up. And by the way, that's a sort of a medical term about referring to the fact that she sat up, Luke using that term. He gave her his hand and lifted her up, and when he had called the saints and widows, by the way, that's the first time that Christians are called saints, or that the disciples were called saints in the book of Acts, is in this instance. When he had called the saints and widows, presented her alive. And it was known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. It was just an amazing thing. And it came to pass that he tarried many days in Joppa with one Simon a tanner. I've got a couple minutes before the kids are going to come up. So I want to talk about the tanner business. You do know what a tanner was, and you know probably how bad it stunk. We're going to find out in the next chapter that he was out by the seaside. There's a reason for that. First of all, you had ready access to water and salt water, which would have been needed in the tanning process, and the breeze would blow the stink away a little bit from this. It's interesting. The Jews, the really serious Jews, regarded a tanner, the occupation itself, as unclean, and avoided anybody who pursued the occupation of tanner. They thought it was unclean. He was touching dead animals all the time. And so Peter's behavior indicates to us that he didn't carry his prejudices. One of the rabbis said, it's impossible for the world to do without tanners, but woe to him who is a tanner. A Jewish woman could sue for divorce if she discovered that her husband was a tanner. So you begin to see some of the difficulties with this, and it's signally impressive that Peter was willing to be with this man. One fellow writing about it said this was a step on the road. Lodging with a tanner was a step on the road to eating with a Gentile, which is what we're going to see in the next chapter. I wanted to talk about one of the things that I had in my notes that I wanted to mention to you, and that was at Tarsus, there were two schools. Now, Paul, as a young man, almost certainly was not educated as a Roman. He describes himself that way in Philippians. He was a Pharisee, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He would not have been educated as a Roman. But when he goes back there to Tarsus for this period of time, he undoubtedly allowed himself to be educated in the tremendous universities that existed there in Tarsus. He would have met with them, for instance, in the market at Athens. They were going to see him over there in the 17th chapter. It's obvious that he has been with, he has a good acquaintance with the Roman philosophers. And almost certainly during this period of time, when he goes back to Cilicia, when he goes back to Tarsus, having been run out of Jerusalem, he probably educated him there. Some of the greatest Stoics of this period came from Tarsus. For instance, Athenodorus was the tutor of Augustus. And Athenodorus, very impressive man, he was actually given divine honors, called a god when he died. And so he would have been dead by this time, but one of his followers was a fellow by the name of Nestor, and he was the tutor of the next emperor, and that was I can't think, maybe Tiberius. I'll get it in a minute. So here, the most supreme Stoics in the empire, writing about this time and teaching in the schools at Tarsus. Now, following them, there's, of course, Caligula and so forth, and Claudius. And then under Nero, one of the greatest men, the fellow who actually ran the empire, was Seneca. And to read Seneca is to read Paul. Now, either Seneca was copying Paul or Paul was copying Seneca, but a lot of their wording and phrasing is very much the same. And so, obviously, Paul has educated himself among these people so that he can teach them. And here you have a man who had Roman citizenship, who could speak in Greek, who could speak in Hebrew, very familiar with the Old Testament. So he writes the book of Hebrews, very familiar in dealing with these Greeks. And he's the man God has chosen to go and begin teaching in these communities. And he would have been very successful in Tarsus in teaching these people with that background, with his varied background. The Lord has chosen him. He has prepared himself and educated himself so that he can do the job. Jesus said, I've chosen you to go preach to the Gentiles. Well, what if God said, I've chosen you? Well, you'd educate yourself. You'd educate yourself so that you can speak the language, so that you can know the illusions and know their background and know their traditions and know their philosophy, the way they think. And Paul's done that so that he can go out and teach these Greeks. As the Lord has chosen him to do it, he's prepared himself for the job God chose him for. And we'll start with the 10th chapter next week.